Hi everyone, I think it is time to begin. Get myself situated. I'm pleased to welcome you to our panel session, Approaches to Indigenous Data Governance in the HASS and Indigenous Research Data Commons. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Turrbal and the Yuggera people, and in recognition of the diversity of the peoples here, I'm also calling out the Quandamooka people. Yeah. I pay my respect to their elders past and present. So I'm Nichola Burton. I'm the Programs Architect of the Australian Research Data Commons HASS and Indigenous RDC. Our Director Jenny Fuster couldn't be here today, so I'll be doing my best to fill in. I'm a white settler woman. My ancestry is from England and Spain, and I grew up most of my life on the West Coast, the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I've worked a little while in the HASS and Indigenous RDC, but when it comes to Indigenous data and Indigenous data governance, I really feel that I'm still a child. What I know, I really know thanks to the generosity of my colleagues, many of whom are here with me today. So with that said, I'm very grateful to be able to introduce my fellow panellists, Laureate Professor Marcia Langton and Associate Professor Kristen Smith from the University of Melbourne, Neenah Gray from the University of New South Wales, Dr. Danielle Armour from the University of Queensland, my colleagues Gavin Stanbrook and Casey Hasloff from the ARDC, and our moderator today is Grant Sara. Thanks, Grant, for being here with us. You always do a fantastic job with these events. The Australian Research Data Commons provides digital research infrastructure to support Australian researchers. The thematic research data commons are groupings of activity within the ARDC that meet the needs of groups of particular research disciplines. And so the HASS and Indigenous RDC serves the needs of humanities, arts, social sciences, and Indigenous research. And I wanted to draw your attention to that grouping because it's an interesting one. So in Australia, we typically group the humanities, arts, and the social sciences together, although there are a lot of diverse disciplines in there. But the addition of Indigenous research makes things complicated because Indigenous data isn't just HASS data. There is a lot of Indigenous HASS data, but there's also Indigenous health and medical data, there's Indigenous earth and ecology data. Indigenous data really touches everything that we do in the ARDC. And this grouping of Indigenous research with HASS research is really a historical one that's based on the structure of the original government investment that initiated these activities a few years ago. So, however, this grouping is also one that we've really benefited from immensely within the HASS and Indigenous RDC because the presence of this Indigenous research focus within the RDC has really enriched the Indigenous data governance aspects of our other activities. So within the HASS and Indigenous Research Data Commons, we partner with other organisations to provide infrastructure in 6 focus areas. So we have the Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities, which is building the social and technical architecture and the core national data assets that strengthen Indigenous research and data governance in Australia. We have the Language Data Commons of Australia, which is making nationally significant language data available for academic and non-academic use. We have the Social Science Research Infrastructure Network, which provides infrastructure for research that contributes to a more equitable and resilient society, particularly the reuse of government administrative data. We have the Australian Internet Observatory, which provides research infrastructure for social media data and digital platform data. We have the Australian Creative Histories and Futures, which is making Australia's rich history and the arts more accessible. And then we also have Connections, which is increasing overall capacity across HASS and Indigenous researchers with activities including our annual summer school and our community data lab. So all of the data types and the research areas that are dealt with by these focus areas interact with Indigenous data governance in different ways. And there are activities built into each focus area that advance Indigenous data governance across these various disciplines, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So in my filling in role, I'll also be introducing one of these focus areas to you today, which is the Language Data Commons of Australia, or LDACA, as their speaker also couldn't be with us. So there are more than 400 languages spoken in Australia, and this country is home to the oldest continuous cultures and languages in the world. LDACA seeks to preserve that rich cultural heritage as well as provide cutting-edge analytics for researchers working with language and text data. LDACA is a collaboration between universities, research infrastructure providers, and Indigenous organisations. And development began in 2021, but you can see the lead collaborators from the most recent phase here. So LDACA addresses finding, securing, collecting and organising language data, providing the tools needed to analyse this data, and training to work with those data and tools. And at the centre of all of these aspects are people, and it's important to note that that's the communities who speak these languages as well as the academic researchers. So there are a lot of challenges in working with language data. It's dispersed, it's underutilised, and it's at risk of loss. It's difficult to know what language data exists and where to find it, and it's rarely described and organised in reusable ways. Processes for granting permissions and getting access are either absent or they're not easy to understand and apply, and there's also a need for the skills and tools to work with this data. And hopefully you can see that these are challenges for research, but they are also challenges that make Indigenous data governance harder to apply for this data. So LDACA's 5 activity streams are addressing each of these challenges. Something that LDACA does really well is build community autonomy into their technical approach. So rather than having a single centralised architecture, LDACA is building a distributed data ecosystem, and that's designed to enable community self-determination and self-sustainability. Some examples of LDACA's work that support Indigenous data governance, including supporting First Languages Australia in the development of the National Collection Strategy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. And that's aiming to uncover and make available linguistic data within collecting institutions all over the nation. LDACA is also developing a set of protocols for repositories that will assist communities in establishing and maintaining their own repositories in a way that is sustainable for them. And a case study that demonstrates LDACA's community-focused approach is the Centre for Australian Languages and Linguistics collection that's held by the Batchelor Institute. LDACA is providing technical expertise, but they're really seeking to meet the priorities that are set by those custodians. And those priorities are primarily increasing community access to their own materials. So the work that LDACA is doing around increasing access methods, increasing the quality of metadata is really focused around that community access. Okay, so sorry for my flyover view. Hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavour of what LDACA is doing, but if you have any questions for the team, I would definitely contact them using these contact methods and sign up for their newsletter to stay in touch with them. Thanks very much. I will now pass on to Marcia Langton, who will speak to us about the Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities area.
Thanks very much, Nichola. Kristen Smith and I are very pleased to present to you on our Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities project. We are building an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data commons. And our project activities are divided into 5 streams, a foundation stream and 4 interconnected substreams of work packages. One is Indigenous Data Governance and Sovereignty, and you know all about that because I spoke about it on Monday in relation to fair and care principles and our governance framework, Indigenous Data Governance Framework. 2, Indigenous Data Catalogue Resources and Extensions. 3, Indigenous Spatio-Temporal Frameworks and Infrastructure. 4, Data Capability Building for Digital Futures in Indigenous Australia. And 5, Indigenous Repositories and Data Rematriation. And so these are designed to collectively lead to improved Indigenous research data practice across Australia. We have an embedded approach to Indigenous data governance. So data governance is the foundation of the project. All substreams, catalogues, spatio-temporal frameworks, capability building and repositories and rematriation are interconnected and guided by the foundation stream. And so the central position of the foundation stream, i.e. Indigenous data governance, reflects the integration of its integration across all project activities. This is a description of our team and our partners. There's a lot of us, but you can see that we have the major institutions and some absolutely wonderful key investigators and project team members from all of those institutions. We have a particular definition of Indigenous data. Data generated intentionally or not by, about or for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Indigenous data refers to information in any format or medium, collected, analysed, stored and interpreted within the context of Indigenous individuals, collectives, populations, entities, lifeways, cultures, knowledge systems, lands, biodiversity, water and other resources. It includes data collected, used or stored by any agency, department, laboratory, organisation, corporation, statutory body, university or research institute, conducted by, with and about Indigenous people or peoples, and data that Indigenous communities have generated and maintained themselves. And just in relation to that, I hope I'm not cutting into our time by making 2 points. One is that there are Indigenous data assets. They exist in reality. That is, there are about 6,000 Indigenous corporations that are collecting data on behalf of their members. They are Indigenous data assets. Number 2, people in research institutes and NCRIS facilities see our definition and they think we're making a big land claim over their data. No, we're not. We're just pointing out the relationality of data. And so there are data collected that refer to Indigenous people, that are about Indigenous people, and we want everyone to be mindful of that so that they can apply the fair and care principles. Now, I know there's a lot more to say about that to make it clear, but there's so much confusion. Anyway, what is encompassed by the term Indigenous data, and perhaps this makes it clearer? Demographics, health data, education, employment and income, social outcomes, cultural data, and there's so much more, but they're the kind of key categories. Who benefits from Indigenous data? Well, obviously Indigenous people and communities, but so too governments and policy makers, researchers and academics, non-government organisations and advocacy groups, the private sector, the Australian public. How Indigenous data benefits these groups? Policy development, resource allocation, advocacy, cultural preservation, accountability. Let's talk about accountability for a minute. Tracking disparities and measuring progress in closing gaps and holding governments accountable is a very core activity of the Closing the Gap partnership involving all Australian governments and the Coalition of Peaks. Our project delivers on priority reform number 4, and that is making data accessible, especially at a regional level. Key ethical considerations include Indigenous data must be collected and used ethically following fair and care principles, privacy guidelines, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property standards, and human rights standards. Indigenous communities and representatives must be involved in decisions about data collection, usage and benefits, and there are many ways to do that. Efforts in Australia are developing Indigenous data governance, ensuring Indigenous control over their data and how it is shared, good practices in Indigenous data governance and mature data ecosystems enhance Indigenous access to data held by custodians. So we see the value that can be derived from Indigenous data as improved public policy and services, improved health outcomes, cultural preservation and empowerment, economic development, monitoring and measuring progress, supporting research and education, encouraging collaboration and partnerships. Our program, Building the Indigenous Research Data Commons, supports 5 communities of Indigenous data custodians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations, and Kristen will talk more about that. 2, universities, researchers and other research bodies. 3, the GLAM sector, that is galleries, libraries, archives and museums. 4, Commonwealth, state, territory and local governments. And 5, the private sector. So at this point, I will hand over to Associate Professor Kristen Smith.
Thanks, Marcia. I have to stand near this one. Yeah. So, in the context of the project that we're underway with, so we started in 2021 and we're still going and it will be running through to mid-2028. So essentially what we are wanting to do is build the foundations for better understandings of Indigenous research communities across Australia, because we know that these communities are quite siloed and very seldom come together. So part of our work and our aims is actually to create the mechanisms in order to bring them together. We also want to make sure that there are better understandings of Indigenous data across Australia, and also the development of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research data catalogue, which we are well underway with. Also, we're building the foundations for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data rematriation and data repository and storage solutions. We're also developing technical architecture and tooling to build cross-sectoral Indigenous data capabilities, and a series of training and education to build Indigenous research data capabilities across the nation. So just to tell you a little bit about where we've come from and what we've actually achieved so far. So we have done a lot of work to establish these foundational Indigenous data capabilities, tools and infrastructure, which we'll show you some snapshots in a few slides' time. We've implemented training programs and workshops. We have both biannual seminars and a range of different events, which I'll talk about a couple towards the end of this talk. We have extensive collaboration with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data custodians, so we work with a lot of different community groups to support them to build their data capabilities. We've also fostered strong international partnerships, and we have specialist input from technical providers and research institutions across the nation. We've also integrated Indigenous knowledge systems with research data science, so we're very keen to ensure that these are working hand in hand. We've also established novel data governance frameworks that are culturally appropriate and align with community needs. We've also laid the groundwork for a sustainable Indigenous data governance into the future. So I'm just going to go through very quickly some of the tooling and resources that we've developed already. All of what we've done so far is a work in progress. We make everything available online, it is all open access, and we want to make sure that it is actually fit for purpose for all types of data custodians who hold Indigenous data. So I'm not going to go into details. We'd love you to go through this QR code, have a look at it. We would love your feedback. As I said, we want these to be as useful for all data custodians of Indigenous data. Just quickly touching on the Indigenous Data Network catalogue model. So what it does, the way that it's been structured, the architecture of it, organises Indigenous data sets and catalogues in a structured and ethical way. It links data to define people or organisations involved or agents. It uses concepts and themes to describe what the data is about, and it aligns with the care and fair principles. It includes catalogues for both data sets and Indigenous agents. And it helps to ensure that data is culturally relevant, well managed and easy to find. So here we have a snapshot of what is our evolving spatial data catalogue. I haven't included a link, it's in the midst of being technically rearranged at the moment, but it will be back up online in a way that reflects this in some ways. As I said, all of the tooling and resources and models that we're creating throughout this project, we're making them all available so we can receive feedback and continue to refine as they evolve. So the spatial data catalogue uses layered maps with polygon and point data to enable users to search and filter data sets based on specific geographic areas. For example, it might be a language region or a native title boundary or protected area, Indigenous protected area. It also enables users to visualise spatial relationships between data sets and Indigenous places. And also you can query features within selected polygons to find relevant data for that region. So this tool, we're hoping, as it evolves and as we have more data connected to it, will be more and more useful for all people across Australia, in particularly Indigenous communities and people. So this spatial querying capability is powered by multiple standards, which allows for complex spatial operations, and DCAT, which ensures the data sets are described in a consistent and searchable way. We also have, this is the second version of our metadata entry tool, and it's a web-based form for entering and submitting metadata about Indigenous data sets. It captures key details like agent information, rights, spatial and temporal data, themes, and contact information. And it also includes a fair and care scoring to assess metadata quality and ethical alignment. It supports file uploads, example loading, and progress saving. And it's designed to ensure culturally appropriate standards aligned metadata for Indigenous data cataloguing. We do understand that the care principles themselves really aren't particularly set up for a scoring mechanism, but what we're hoping a tool like this will do is point people in the right directions of the elements that you really need to look at and include in your metadata labelling when you are going about creating catalogues or refining catalogues. Now I'm just going to talk to you about one of our case studies that is across all of our work, well, multiple of our work packages. As Marcia said before, we do work with multiple Indigenous communities to ensure that all of our work is based from this ground-up proposition rather than a top-down process or a technically focused process that isn't going to be useful for people on the ground. So we've been working with multiple clan groups and leaders in North East Arnhem Land to develop local Indigenous data governance in Nichola in North East Arnhem Land. So you can see the map here. It's a very remote region of Australia. So we've been working at the local bilingual community school in Nichola. At that school, they have a very large data archive of materials that have been developed at the school across the course of 50 plus years. Now this particular archive has got nationally significant items in it, including anything from the resources that have been developed in the school for teaching within the school that have been developed by the local Yolngu people in multiple Yolngu Mata languages. But it also has a huge plethora of audio-visual material. There are cartographic maps, any sort of different format that you can imagine for digitisation is in this archive. And like many remote places across Australia, particularly across the top end of Australia, they're really vulnerable to anything from environmental issues. I'm wrapping up. Okay, I'll cut to the chase. We've been working to digitise material there and to work with local community leaders to ensure that we're both preserving the material that's in there for future generations, but also making sure that the cataloguing tools and resources that we're developed come from a place that is useful in community. So that's just one of our case studies. So we've been working up there for the last 3 or 4 years, trying to ensure that both our tooling is correct, but also we have resources for other communities who have a great and dire need for digitisation. We've also been developing a number of international partnerships and case studies. So we've been working with several groups in Makassar in South Sulawesi, also in Hokkaido University and support the Sapporo Ainu Association in Hokkaido, Japan, And we also have partnerships in France with the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, I've absolutely mangled that, and the Musée de Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, France. So the French partnership is more to do with the repatriation of material from collections that are held in institutions in Europe. And the partnerships that we're having in Makassar and in Hokkaido are more to do with sharing and building capabilities across nations. As we mentioned, we also hold regular events in different forums and in different manners. We recently, this year, have held a workshop and symposium up in Darwin at the Darwin Convention Centre, which was a co-located event with the Darwin Aboriginal Art Fair. So that was looking at art, knowledge and data, so trying to better understand some of the issues related to the knowledge held within art and how that data is managed. On the weekend, we also held the IDN's inaugural Indigenous Data-thon that we had at the Cube at the Queensland University of Technology, where we brought together people from all over Australia to tackle multiple health-related clinical data sets with a lens of Indigenous data governance over the top of it. So that was a really successful event, and we're definitely going to be doing more of them. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks for listening. But I do encourage you to go to our QR codes to have a little look at the rest of our work.
All right, can everyone hear me okay out there? Beautiful. All right, so I'm representing the Australian Creative Histories and Futures project, and I'll be just talking with you about our approaches to Indigenous data governance in the project. So what is Australian Creative Histories and Futures? Well, it's a 4-year project aimed at augmenting Australia's cultural data capabilities by developing an enduring digital infrastructure to meet the future research needs of the creative arts specifically. So it's guided by the FAIR and CARE principles, which I won't go into because we already have been discussing them a lot this week. And it's got a couple of different goals. So we want to ensure sustainability, facilitate interoperability between the partner data sets, develop Indigenous data governance principles, and upskill the sector as well. And this is a partnership between the ARDC, UNSW, the DAO, which is the Design and Arts Australia Online Dataset, Creative Australia, and ACME. So in the project, we have a couple of different advisory groups as well. And one of them is the Indigenous Advisory Group, which I wanted to ensure was a key part of the project as well. And the partners in the Indigenous Advisory Group are helping me navigate the big report that I'm writing, but they're also going to help navigate the rest of the project as well. I've got representation from community representatives to sector representatives. Some really valuable knowledge is exhibited in the partners as well. So I'm really grateful for the partners, some of which are here today, members of the Indigenous Advisory Group. And I pride myself on the fact that I did try to get people from all across Australia that represent different clan groups as well. So I don't think we have the same mobs on the groups as well, which is really important to pull out. And another thing too is that there's Indigenous representation on all the advisory groups as well. And the special thing about the Indigenous Advisory Group is that the reports that come through the Indigenous Advisory Group won't go to the steering committee until it's been fully endorsed by our Indigenous Advisory Group as well. So that's really important to call out too. So there's been a couple of different things I've done that I've had to do. Of course, you don't kick off a good project without doing a literature review and your conceptual diagrams. And you truly do stand on the shoulders of those who come before you. So Marcia and I aren't going to do an acrobatic act today, but just to point out that she has been the grounding force of some of my thinking for this project as well. So thank you for that. There's been a lot of working intimately with partners and then doing the community consultation as well. one of the main points is to understand where the partners are at individually and to understand sector needs and the level of understanding that each partner has with Indigenous data governance. And so the main point of the project that I want to focus on with Indigenous data governance here is, well, how can we draw upon the amazing work that our partners are already doing? How can we draw upon the work that they already have internally? But the other thing that I needed to think about too was the difference between Indigenous data governance holistically and in the broader sector versus the needs specifically for the arts sector. So this is my little diagram that I did up, and it's looking at the obligations arts organisations and data sets need to keep in mind when working collaboratively with community. And I think some of those pillars are really about well-being, individual well-being and community well-being, and how do they facilitate creative well-being. And the other thing that is very unique to arts organisations is the way that they uphold artist integrity and the cultural stewardship values that come through that too. So to me, creative well-being, cultural stewardship and artist integrity create the trusting foundations enabled to share data through Indigenous data governance principles. And I put up a little diagram of the Priority Reform 4 diagram that Marcia and Kristen talked about previously, just to make that link between sharing data and well-being. So I encourage you all to go have a look at the Priority Reform 4 stuff if you aren't familiar with that either. So a little bit about our partners and a little bit about the diversity of them as well. So ACME is a collection that comprises over 40,000 moving images, and they've been acquired between the 1940s to the 2000s. And they've got a range of internal and government policy legislations that governs their data. And this includes, for those who aren't familiar with some of the Australian stuff, but this includes reconciliation action plans, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property documents, protocols, as well as their collection strategy. And I wanted to pull out these documents because even though they speak very differently to different sections of the organisation, when they start talking about Indigenous data, they are very much centred on 5 pillars: self-determination, partnership, leadership, cultural capability and integrity, and transparency. And so one of the questions I ask here is, how can you make values, principles and pillars of Indigenous data governance accessible to those with little resources? So ACME is a good example of a data set that has lots of resources, and so they've been able to also write some of these protocol documents in collaboration and being guided by people like, for example, Terry Janke. Beautiful. We also have Ausstage, and they're very proud of their Quabbary data that they have just sort of rejigged in their system. So Ausstage is a data set that records historical performances in Australia, plus it has many international links, for example, like Theatre Aotearoa as well. The only thing about Ausstage is that it does not keep the physical documents. It only goes by things that are validated online. And the Ausstage manager, Liz Larkin, I have to do a shout out to her if she's listening or if she'll see this later. She is the powerhouse that runs Ausstage. Everything about Ausstage is central to, Liz is central to everything at Ausstage. And without Liz, I don't think Ausstage would be Ausstage as well. And so I just wanted to give an example of some of the data that Ausstage has as well. And just a bit of a warning, it does have outdated offensive language here too. But Ausstage, for example, will take a newspaper article. This one was printed in 1888, and it talks about a Quabbary that happened publicly in, where was it? Somewhere in New South Wales. But yes, 1888, you take an article like this, it goes into Ausstage like that, but you can also see that some of the insensitive language has been carried on as well. But nonetheless, Ausstage, with all the data that's in there, was able to map out where exactly some of these public performances of co-operies were happening. Sorry. And yeah, you can actually download this all into a big Excel spreadsheet and then ship it all off into raw graphs, and you have a really amazing visual like this. So that's why I like Ausstage as well. And one of the questions that I ask here is, how can you make arts practices uniform across Australia without necessarily having a unified approach? So some of the best practices that I've seen already happening is that we're promoting cultural sensitivity and awareness. Partners are partnering in doing consultation with community. They're embedding those cultural identifiers and using appropriate metadata and language for new data and archival material. As seen by ACME, they have some really fantastic internal frameworks. And the long-term sustainability of some of the governance structures in the partners is really great as well. So I'd love to draw upon that in my research a little bit more as we go along. Some of the challenges, though, of course, we have to think about resources. Another thing we have to think about is Indigenous representation in senior staff and in mainstream roles as well. The long-term sustainability of some of the data sets and systems. Sorry, I'm reading off my slide here. Appropriating data that is already in databases is also a hard thing. So locating that data, finding it, fixing it, that's one of the struggles at the moment. And as I said previously, there's no uniform approach to Indigenous data governance in the arts sectors at the moment. And the monitoring, evaluation and feedback is something as well. That is a challenge experienced by the partners. So the two questions that I have for reflection are, how can we make even progress towards Indigenous data governance across all Australian data sets, regardless of resource availability? And how can we make arts practices uniform across Australia to create a unified approach to Indigenous data governance in the arts? And I'll pass on to Danielle Armour. Thank you.
Couple of tough gigs to follow. But today I'm going to talk to you about the Social Science Research Infrastructure Network. And this is a major initiative funded under the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy with the support from the ARDC, UQ, ABS, ANU and University of WA. We've only had our funding for approximately about 1 year, so we are in the building stages at the moment. To set the scene, social sciences are essential to understanding and responding to challenges our communities face. Whether it's inequality, justice, health or sustainability, social science research helps us make sense of complex societal issues. But despite its importance, social science research in Australia faces infrastructure gaps that limit its potential. We must acknowledge a deeper issue. Historically, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have had limited trust in data collected, particularly from government institutions. This mistrust stems from experience where data collection, analysis and reporting have caused harm rather than benefit. And the Social Science Research Infrastructure Network seeks to change this narrative by embedding ethical, inclusive and community-led approaches into our infrastructure. I'll walk you through how the SSRIN, or the Social Science Research Infrastructure Network, is structured, what it aims to achieve and how we're working to ensure Indigenous data is handled with care, respect and accountability. Oh, that's back. So the project has 5 streams, and it's improving data usability, so making complex data sets easier to access and use. It's about health and social data integration, linking data across domains to better understand lived experiences, enhancing discoverability and building an existing data set to ensure researchers can find and build upon valuable data. And 4, which is what the stream that I co-lead with Professor Francis Mitrao, is developing guidelines for users of government admin data and Indigenous people so we can promote ethical and respectful data use. And 5 is training and capacity building to equip researchers with skills and knowledge to use data effectively and responsibly. Together, these streams form a comprehensive strategy to strengthen social science research and ensure it serves to the public good. Each stream is interconnected. For example, improving usability and discoverability supports better integration, and capacity building ensures that researchers can apply these. Our aims are to provide to improve the discoverability, accessibility and usability of social science data, to enhance existing infrastructure relevant to social sciences, to build capacity among researchers across Australia, to foster collaboration between university, government, NGOs and communities, and to develop Indigenous data guidelines that support ethical and respectful research practices, which is what I'm going to talk about mainly today. These aims reflect a commitment to both technical excellence and social responsibility, and to address historical mistrust. We are establishing a representative of Indigenous governance structure. This ensures that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices guide the development and use of data protocols, and not as an afterthought, but as a foundational principle. We are aware of the excellent work that other people are doing as well, and that will come into how we design these guidelines. We're not just collaborating infrastructure, we're building trust that takes time, care and genuine collaboration. So a cornerstone of the SSRIN is to develop the development of the Indigenous Data Guidelines. These guidelines will serve as a formal protocol, a clear ethical framework and a checklist for researchers working with Indigenous data. We'd like these guidelines to be thought of as something like a heart foundation tick, so when data analysers or researchers are using this data, they go through the guidelines and follow them so that they are endorsed, I guess. The goal is to have a responsible, respectful and community endorsed practices. To support this, we've established an Indigenous steering committee. Members come from NGOs, academia and government organisation, and all bring in a deep expertise in data and its use. Their role is to guide the development of guidelines, drawing not only on existing frameworks and best practices, but also their lived experiences. We are also forming a community reference group. While the steering committee is full of professionals who work closely with data, we felt it was essential to include voices from community members who do not work close. This helps ensure that the guidelines reflect broader community values, not just technical or institutional ones. We are conscious of cultural load that this can place on communities, but we also believe it's necessary to have multiple voices included. Members of the reference group will be nominated by the steering committee and compensated for their time and contributions. We're aiming for a diverse group to ensure a wide range of views are represented and to maximise community benefit. Ultimately, these guidelines will help ensure that Indigenous data is used in ways that are responsible, respectful and endorsed. And we will also develop validated and accessible protocols for analysing and reporting on Indigenous data. These protocols are designed to increase the likelihood that Indigenous people and communities benefit from government admin data and research while minimising the risk of inappropriate use. So the SSRIN will engage with several key Indigenous data assets, including PLIDA, or the Personal Level Integrated Data, electronic health records, and other admin data sources. PLIDA, for example, combines de-identified data from multiple government sources to offer comprehensive insights into Australians' lives, covering health, education, income, employment and demographics. This kind of data is powerful, but with power comes responsibility. We must ensure that its use is guided by ethical principles, so the fair and care principles, and community oversight. And we must ask who benefits from this data, who is represented and who is missing. These are the questions that guide our work. Our governance work includes establishing relationships through the Indigenous-led Steering Committee and Community Reference Group, ensuring that anything about us is not done without us, and developing guidelines for users of government admin data on Indigenous peoples. We're going to pilot the guidelines to a real-world research question, and once the guidelines are developed, we'll put them into practice to ensure they work. The work is grounded in a broader vision that we can lead in ethical and inclusive data use. We want to ensure Indigenous peoples and communities directly benefit from how administrative data are analysed and reported. So how are we going? As I said, we've only had the funding for 12 months. So we've had one steering committee meeting, and we have another one coming up in a few weeks. We are in the process of establishing the Indigenous Community Reference Group, and we're actively reviewing existing good practices and guidelines to inform the development of our own frameworks. We're excited about what's ahead. We know it's going to be lots of work, but we know that we've had lots of people do really good work in front of us to help support this work. And that's the end of the story for SSRIN.
Today I'll be presenting on some information about the ARDC's Indigenous internship and the work that I've been doing over the past 7 months, just to give some insight into what the internship is. But first I just wanted to touch on my journey to this position. I'm a proud Gunditjmara man with connections to Lake Conda. I've also completed my undergrad in science and am currently halfway through my Masters of Data Science. I worked in the corporate world at NAB for 2 years, but I was always looking for more direct impact on community. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity the internship has provided. It has been an incredible learning experience, allowing me to explore new concepts such as Indigenous Data Governance and the care and fair principles, thankfully with the guidance of wonderful mentors along the way. This ARDC internship plays a vital role in fostering Indigenous talent within research and related industries. The internship exists as part of ARDC's HASS and Indigenous Research Data Commons and is aligned with Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities and the Language Data Commons of Australia focus areas of the RDC. As the intern, I have direct contact with Jenny Fuster, the director of HASS and RDC, while being based within the Indigenous Data Network at the University of Melbourne with day-to-day supervisors Marcia Langton and Kristen Smith. Now in its third iteration, the internship is shaped around the interests and skills of each intern, while maintaining an overarching focus on data infrastructure, Indigenous data governance, and the broader life cycles across diverse communities and stakeholders. Thanks to the wide networks of the ARDC and the IDN, I've had the opportunity to work with a broad range of people and organisations with diverse skills and experiences. Throughout the past 7 months, my work has varied a lot, and I think that's a normal thing in research. 2 tasks that have been moving throughout the internship are the IDN data catalogue and the Home of Field Notes dashboard that I've been doing with Aldaka. I've been working with Karong AI, which is the tech team for the IDN, to add and enhance entries in the IDN catalogue that they have been building. The catalogue contains metadata for Indigenous data network assets. The catalogue is built on a resource description framework that follows community-led metadata standards. This makes it machine-readable, interoperable with other systems, and aligned with international standards. From the various activities I've done with Karong AI, I've begun to appreciate the importance of high-quality metadata that uses standards that will endure into the future. In collaboration with the Aldaka tech and engagement teams, I've been developing this dashboard at the bottom here that will be used in workshops to give communities an insight into the content of field notes that were collected during the 1970s in southeast Queensland around here by Swedish linguist Niels Holmer. The pilot for this project focuses on 2 notebooks from the collection, which includes informants from mobs such as Waka Waka, Garang Garang and Gubby Gubby. The dashboard will hopefully engage community into interacting further with these resources and guide discussion on how the collection should be shared with community. Collaborating with the ARDC tech team has helped me understand the importance of reusability when building a dashboard and ensuring that is not just another bespoke dashboard that gets forgotten. While being involved with ARDC, I've also been exposed to research object crates, and I'm starting to appreciate their potential for supporting community-driven data governance and ensuring that research outputs remain accessible and meaningful over time, which I'll touch on in the next slide. As the intern, I've also been very fortunate to attend many trips around Australia and gone to many events and conferences over the past 7 months. I've attended IATSIS, Pulama, the language conference, and recently I've attended the IDN Datathon that ran over the past weekend that Kristen spoke to. These conferences hosted a wide variety of speakers from across the Indigenous community. At IATSIS, we heard from community projects such as the Wellbeing project, which does work with repatriation. There were sessions that covered initiatives that were teaching communities how to work in archival data and language collections efforts highlighting the importance of high-quality metadata to support future reuse. Sessions at Pulama range from people just beginning their language journeys, such as creating community dictionaries and from community dictionaries to organisations managing larger collections. These conferences expanded my understanding of the diverse stages of Indigenous data governance across communities and deepened my appreciation of the ways they are shaping their own data futures. While at Pulama, I also connected with our DACA tech team. They were running informal workshops during the conference breaks on how RO crates can be applied in different contexts. For example, they collaborated with ARDS, which is the Aboriginal Resource and Development Services up in the NT, to develop a metadata schema for the ARDS archive, designed to represent Yolngu knowledges such as kinship systems and clan connections. ARDS and Wadaka were also working on a self-governed access interface for Yolngu people to explore material in the archive based on their background, which includes multi or clan groups. And as Kristen and Marcia mentioned, the IDN held its inaugural datathon over at QUT over the past weekend, which brought together data analysts, scientists, clinicians, and Indigenous data governance experts. The weekend provided a valuable opportunity to explore the ICU and renal data sets through the lens of care principles and Indigenous data governance concepts. As a participant, I found it impressive to see how each team approached the data in unique ways and produced meaningful insights in just a day and a half of very intense work. The highlight for me was watching people from such diverse backgrounds really engage meaningfully with these concepts, many of which were completely new to them. And during the internship, I've had a lot of opportunities to go out to some archives, one in Melbourne, which is the UniMel Institutional Archive at University of Melbourne. That has a range of historical information but faces challenges, including around 40 years of backlog and limited funding and staff. The second is the Nichola School Literature Production Centre archive in northeast Arnhem Land, which is in a much more fragile state, even with black mould growing throughout. The LPC houses an irreplaceable and endangered archive of half a century of bilingual education materials and other rare historical resources from diverse clan groups and young organisations within the northeast Arnhem Land region. This piece of work is a case study in the IIRC project, and there is a focus to digitise the contents within the endangered archive. In my first few months, I was tasked with reviewing the hard drives that were being used to store the digital digital archive. I consolidated them to a consistent format and performed a sanity check of what had been scanned and what quality they had been scanned in over the past few trips. This gave me a unique insight into the size of the archive and how much work still needs to be done. I also contributed to designing the workflow for storing and transferring data during digitisation. This setup involved having multiple master hard drives in Nichola and Melbourne, plus 2 transfer drives that moved between the 2 locations. This approach ensured that there are backups in the unlikely event that a hard drive was lost or damaged in the process. Working through this somewhat messy digital archive gave me a real appreciation for the importance of good archival practice. And then in August, I was actually fortunate enough to go up to Nichola and see the new hard drive system in action when I spent 2 weeks up there with our team and several volunteers to digitise materials. Even though both these archives are at very different stages and capabilities, a key takeaway for me is the importance of applying the same standards to both, always with future use in mind. Long-lasting documentation is essential, and I think this should guide work across all archives. Cool. I would like to thank everyone that has helped me along the way during this internship. Your guidance has been invaluable and made this a very positive learning experience for me. Thank you.
Excellent. Alrighty. So my name is Gavin, as previously introduced. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the Australian Research Data Commons Indigenous Data Governance program. And so I think firstly we just want to speak to context. Why has this program come about? Why now? And what does it look like? So in 2019, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance published the CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Governance in response to the FAIR Principles for Open and Accessible Data. At the ARDC, we provide Australian researchers with a competitive advantage through data. The CARE Principles allow us to centre the rights of Indigenous people to their data in this endeavour. The Australian Research Data Commons considers the CARE Principles important not only because they allow us to respectfully and meaningfully engage with Indigenous data and communities in our projects, but also because care is vital to realising self-determination for Indigenous people in Australia. The Program Manager role for Indigenous Data Governance was developed to operationalise the ARDC's commitment to the CARE Principles of Indigenous Data Governance. It's the first of its kind across the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy Network, or NCRIS. In accordance with ARDC values, the program is ambitious and aims to develop ARDC's skills and capability in Indigenous data management and embed Indigenous data governance across the ARDC matrix. It's focused on delivering care-aligned outcomes for the ARDC and our partners. It's flexible and responsive to the needs of our partners and the ARDC. It's collaborative and engages ARDC expertise as well as the expertise of our partners in its delivery. And it's transparent with input and review from the ARDC matrix and our Indigenous partners. So now I'm going to talk through the key pillars of the Indigenous Data Governance program. The work plan has 4 main components. The first is support the thematic research data commons and our strategic pillars. And this is through different initiatives, for example, Indigenous engagement and data governance advice, support and drop-in sessions, an intranet channel for ARDC staff, which will host our resources and discussion, and embedding the CARE principles in activities across the HASS and I focus areas. So, for example, collaborating with Danielle on the Social Science Research Infrastructure Network, with Neenah on the Australian Creative Histories and Futures, and as well with Nichola on the Australian Internet Observatory project. Just a few examples. Another will be policies and procedures development. So looking at resources and guidelines for our partners in relation to Indigenous data governance, policies and procedures. for the practical implementation of Indigenous data governance across the ARDC in our strategic pillars. Then there's skills and knowledge uplift. So ARDC all-staff workshop on Indigenous data, training package for internal ARDC staff as well as our partners and stakeholders, and basic in-depth training on questions of cultural protocol and Indigenous matters that as they relate to our work. And finally, to provide Indigenous engagement protocols. So this includes Indigenous stakeholder engagement guidelines for ARDC staff, as well as awareness raising for Indigenous cultural protocols and what that means in our day-to-day work at the ARDC. Now I'll go through in a bit more in depth into these work packages. So supporting the thematic research data commons and strategic pillars will include a case-by-case advice on Indigenous data governance projects across the RDCs, fortnightly Indigenous data drop-in sessions, which a bunch of our colleagues routinely attend and are quite excellent discussion spaces. As I said before, an Indigenous discussion page on the intranet, producing care resources for ARDC staff for the effective implementation of the care principles, facilitated fortnightly situational awareness meetings around addressing the question of Indigenous engagement for our colleagues, and presence on Indigenous data and data governance advisory groups in our projects like SSIRN or ACHF, as well as sector engagement at conferences, for example, as Casey mentioned, the IATSA Summit, the Palima Conference, and as well contributing to sector discussion and engagement around Indigenous data governance. So, for example, the Science Technology Australia Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, as well as the NIAA Governance of Indigenous Data Working Group. Next, I'll go on to policies and procedures development. So this work package aims to produce resources for ARDC staff, for example, a resource on what is Indigenous cultural intellectual property, an ARDC Indigenous data governance framework with accompanying resources, FAQs on Indigenous culture and history, and glossary of terms that relate to Indigenous community matters for our colleagues in the organisation. And really the purpose there is to familiarise non-Indigenous colleagues with Indigenous concepts and worldviews. We'll also include resources for our partners and stakeholders, and these are Indigenous data definitions resources, careful fairness in projects for our stakeholders, and how to embed Indigenous data governance in data infrastructure and systems. And now we'll move on to skills and knowledge uplift, which is a bit of a meaty area that we've really been getting stuck into recently. And so what this looks like is essentially just developing training resources for our organisation and our colleagues, but also for external stakeholders and partners. So addressing the questions, for example, what is Indigenous data, Indigenous people's rights to our data, and practical approaches to Indigenous data governance. Also, external training packages on Indigenous data for our stakeholders, and careful fairness in practice, as well as Indigenous data governance frameworks. And finally, Indigenous cultural protocol at the ARDC, and allyship and cultural sensitivity. Now I'll go through providing engagement protocols. Essentially, this is about making sure that our organisation and our colleagues are ready and fit to be able to engage in a culturally respectful way and in a meaningful way with Indigenous communities that derive benefit for our communities and our partners. So these include guidelines, procedures, and advice, essentially to guide effective and meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities. So what does this mean for our organisation? Well, to summarise, it means the consistent application of Indigenous data governance in our projects, regular Indigenous data drop-in sessions for skills uplift, but also to address the bizarre and wacky questions that might come up that I always find interesting, guidance and advice on engaging with Indigenous partners, embedding careful fairness across our projects and in our infrastructure, training for ARDC colleagues on Indigenous data and Indigenous cultural protocol, and training for our partners on Indigenous data and Indigenous data governance. And I will then invite you all to find out more about all the wonderful projects we talked about here on this QR code. Really quickly, if you can snap that, and I'll just drop to a few of our impact case studies, which you can also find on this link here. And I am now going to hand it over to Uncle Grant Sara, who's going to moderate the Q&A discussion. So I hope everyone's been submitting questions online. Uncle Grant's been collating those. So I'm going to hand that over to you now, Uncle Grant. If you'd like to, you're okay to sit there if you like. If you want to come up here, yeah, sure. Yeah.
That's for online questions. We've got 0.
Oh, that's okay.
So, thank you very much for each of your presentations. Particularly you, Casey, you're a bit nervous. Don't be nervous. You got an important role into the future. That's what you've got to recognise. And for the same with you, Gavin, and Neenah. So, need you to be strong. Are there any questions from the audience first to put to any of the panel members? Don't be shy. Have we got a microphone?
All right, straight into the mic. G'day, I'm Megan Wong from the Australian Research Data Commons. I just wondered, in all your engagement out there with traditional owner communities, what is one of the number one things that you hear there's a cry out for and need for in terms of, say, resourcing or education?
I'm going to go straight to Marcia on that one.
A really good question. What we hear, and other groups might get a different response, is that people in the Indigenous corporations and even in government want more data sharing, and they want the data sharing to be easier. And there's a urgent need to do data linkage and to improve our data reporting, especially in relation to, closing the gap in health, incarceration, removal of children from their families, and so many other critical areas for the Indigenous community. So data sharing is number one. There's been very little data sharing, and we're just starting to get through to the data custodians that it's really important that they work out ways to share data with Indigenous communities so that they can determine their own priorities and work out what's happening in their regions, and so that we have more granular data at the regional level in accordance with priority reform number 4.
In the arts, I've found that there are a couple of things that we want to be able to do, and that's why the interoperability of the project is so important as well. So Danielle mentioned the discoverability and the findability of archival material for the arts, which is really important. I think for the arts, there's also that there needs to be an acknowledgement between creative arts, but then also the materials that overlap with the arts. So, for example, clapsticks are seen as an instrument, for example, and may be archived in such a way, but the way that they might be painted or carved also tells a different story. And so those nuances between history and creative histories as well needs to be acknowledged within that I think often gets missed as well. And just to pare it back a bit too, and to put it really simply, artists aren't being acknowledged the way that they want to be acknowledged either. And so being very aware of the 400 plus different language and clan groups that we have in Australia, the different spelling that goes into all of them, which we were discussing a little bit earlier, between Nunukal, for example. I'm a Nunukal woman, but I spell Nunukal very differently to how Becky does, who's presenting in another forum here. That's just one example. So just being open to the cultural nuances that also come through, and the cultural sensitivities that I find, number one.
I guess one of the things that I've found quite frequently is not only that people want to be able to manage their own data in ways that is going to be useful for not just the current generation but for their future generations, but they also are really demanding that everyone who is holding Indigenous data, in particular, whether it's one particular community or more broadly, they want other data custodians to treat it ethically and fairly. So this is something that I've heard great passion coming from some of our partners, particularly up in Nichola. There are a lot of people who are quite upset about how their data is managed, stored, accessed and used, and in a way that they have no say over. So that's also a regular thing that we hear from communities that we're working with.
Yep. Resources. And that's, we talk about oldest continuous people and culture in this country, but we don't actually properly respond, do we? There's a whole story, Yirrkala, Macassar, there's a whole story that can be recreated, but we're more likely to lose that connection and story because of the lack of resources, the lack of integrity in this space. And yet it's rich with bauxite mining and all that sort of stuff. Where's your priorities? Any other questions from the audience? And then I'm going to ask a key question to each of the people while we have the time.
It's similar to this question. Donnie Johannesson, QUT. Garang Garang Cubby Cubby's my mob, doing research, a question across the board. Doing research on mob, how do you deal with being triggered, and what sort of self-care do you take?
I think to put it simply, Donnie, I have a big cup of tea with me every time I feel like I'm going to come, every time I'm walking into a situation that may be identified as, putting myself in a vulnerable situation. Always just like to have a big cup of tea. And I think what's grounding in that moment is also you are building constantly upon the work that has been done previously as well. And it's our cultural obligations for our ancestors too. So without getting emotional, a big cup of tea, remembering where you come from, and having a bit of a breather as well when you need to. But yeah, I love a good cup of tea, as you guys know.
What's your thoughts, Danielle, on that?
I think we do need to take self-care because, as I spoke about, we are often not framed in nice ways through research, non-Indigenous researchers. And I often will, on a Friday afternoon, go to the beach, put my feet in the water and ground myself and remember why I'm in this role and why I'm doing this, because of the way that our families have been treated prior.
Nichola, what about you from a non-Indigenous perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question because I'm so aware of the fact that I'm working in areas that have such intense personal impact for so many of my colleagues, and that however much I can try to empathise, that'll never be my lived experience, and I can't know it the way that you know it. And it can be hard to, it can be confronting. You know, I'm an English woman, right? Like it's a hard thing to confront, to know that that's part of my ancestry and my history. So I guess it's important for me to connect with my colleagues as people and to understand the importance of facing this stuff and doing what we can head on, because, you know, with that ancestry comes responsibility for me.
Nichola, you had English and what was the other? French?
Spanish.
Spanish. Buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches.
Yeah, it's all colonial, all the way back.
But again, you're born here in Australia, yeah?
Born in the UK, came
Born
over
in the
here when I
UK.
was 9. So
Part-
it's my
yeah.
home.
Part of what we've got to do is to accept that when we as adults and parents talk to our children, we expect them to be honest. So we as a young nation of Australian society need to also be honest and move beyond the fear, denial, the guilt and the blame. And you, through your presence here, you're very welcome in this country. And people who are born in this country, you belong in this country. So time to draw a line in the sand and just tell the bloody truth about this and properly resource it to do what it's got to do. How do we sustain the continuous story of one of the oldest continuous people and cultures in the world? Invest in it is one thing. So, yeah. Individual questions. We'll keep... You have a question at the back? Yeah.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for speaking today. I really enjoyed all of your talks. I'm Liv. I'm from the Australian Research Data Commons. Okay, so my question is, what are the risks of excluding Indigenous voices in shaping national digital research infrastructure, and how can they be mitigated?
Good question.
Well, I'll start with one of the obvious ones. There are many, but one big issue is that Indigenous people, Indigenous data protections and rights are not mentioned in the legislation, in the DAT legislation. We've made a submission in the when the legislation started, was first promulgated, I approached the National Data Commissioner, and basically we've been ignored. And unless our work is acknowledged in the new version of the legislation, we will not have made any advance in relation to the fair and care principles, ethical use of Indigenous data, use and reuse, and all of the issues that we're contending with. So I would say that, including Indigenous people, Indigenous data rights and standards in the legislation is a critical one.
Yep. Yeah.
I might just add briefly. I think just to add on to what Marcia was saying, one of the really interesting things about, or one of the amazing things about empowering mob Indigenous communities and organisations to access, use and apply their data to their own priorities and interests of their communities is that there is genuine real world benefit and impact. We're talking about closing the gap every year. There's a report and we're constantly told, we're missing on this target, we're missing on this target. And the incredible thing that I get to see in experiencing Indigenous communities harnessing their data and being considered in these infrastructure plans and legislative processes is that they get to be at the head of the seat. They get to be the decision makers and they get to be the people who set the priorities. So I had the wonderful opportunity to be a mentor at the Indigenous Data Network Datathon over the weekend, where we got to hear from the local mob within the Southeast Brisbane Aboriginal Health Network, who have been able to, and please shut me up if I'm not allowed to speak about this, but who've been able to do some brilliant work over the last decade, building their medical services from the ground up and really engaging with their community to where now they have, tens of thousands of members of the community signed up to the medical centre, completing 715s, and the data that they're able to collect from that really means that they're empowered to make arguments to funding bodies and institutions about the types of funding agreements or mechanisms they need in place to look after their communities. So it's not just around service provision and the reality that empowered communities means that they actually can engage with their mob in meaningful ways and get young Indigenous people into the health service quicker and earlier. But it's also that they are able to, as a collective, link data from other assets, for example, the Mater Mothers Hospital, to think more concretely about what are the priorities of their communities, and then they essentially develop programs and mechanisms to meet those needs. So it's a really good example of Indigenous people being included and considered within these legislative or roadmaps, for example, and being able to get genuine, real benefit for it for local people on the ground. And that's really, I think, one of the key priorities for all of us here today.
I just want to throw a curly question in for Kirsten and Nichola. Is this data sovereignty legally enforceable, or the requirement for it, and does it just apply to researchers? Does it apply to governments and corporations?
Look, I think there are multiple things that we could unpack in that question.
Yep.
Number one, we do sit within a regulatory framework in Australia where very little of the calls for data sovereignty are enforceable. However, I don't think that's necessarily a huge issue. Mm-hmm. What we really need to be thinking through is not only, obviously there needs to be some regulatory reform. We do know that there is ICIP regulation being drafted at the moment, which hopefully will go to Parliament at some point next year. But we do know that what actually needs to happen is there needs to be a lot of capability building and a lot of resources thrown into building people's capability to work with data. You can call for data sovereignty all you like, but if there's no resources and no capacity and no capability, it's not actually going to do anything. So that's why we're really focused in our work in thinking through Indigenous data governance and covering the bases of everyone who holds data that is Indigenous data. It's an issue around equity. It's about power. It's about shifting some of these power imbalances. Are we interested in equity in Australia or not? If we forget about these issues, if we omit Indigenous issues or people from, as Marcia was saying, the Data Availability and Transparency Act, then we're at a great risk of further decline in equity. And I think that's the core underbelly of what we're talking about, what a lot of people actually mean when they call for data sovereignty.
No, but you're my next question though, Nichola. And I'm going to go through my prepared questions. To Nichola, what can infrastructure organisations do to make change and move towards better Indigenous data governance practice, which is really an extension of that?
Yeah, so I think it can be easy to get stuck on the size of that problem because there is so much to Indigenous data governance and Indigenous data sovereignty, and so many of the challenges, we just don't know how to solve them. So as an organisation with limited resources, you can just go, well, I don't know where to start and I don't know who can help. And when we try and find partners, there's, everyone is so overburdened. And so I think the approach that we've taken has been, in part, obviously to talk to our Indigenous partners and trying to set the priorities of what we do, and also to say, well, if those resources are so limited, what can we do to increase the resources? What can we do to increase capability, in Indigenous data professionals? And so I think things like the Indigenous Data Governance Masterclass, like the Indigenous internship, like trying to make sure that there are Indigenous data governance work packages in all of the infrastructure building projects that we do, many of which, we're saying, well, can we have identified Indigenous roles there? Can we be expanding that capability? I think that's something that we can do as infrastructure providers.
Yeah. Neenah, how can Australian Creative Histories and Futures positively impact Indigenous data governance and Indigenous governance practices across the arts?
Thanks, Grant. Well, as mentioned in my presentation, we currently have no universal Indigenous Data Governance principles for the arts specifically that focus on artist integrity, cultural stewardship. So I think that the principles and the insights that come out through the projects will be very informative to the sector, as this will be kind of a new thing to do actually. So yeah, looking forward to getting it done.
Well, that's up to you three young ones in particular. Yep. Danielle, what's it like to be deadly in the daytime and the night time? No, pass, digress. How can Indigenous data governance guidelines and frameworks ensure the use and sharing generally reflect community priorities and cultural protocols rather than external institutional agendas?
That's why we've got the multiple committees to ensure that we have multiple voices. When we work in institutions, sometimes we forget what it's like to be on, working, what it's like to forget when we don't know the difference in legislations and rules and regulations in data. So hence we've done that. In the SSRI project, I actually sit on the steering committee for the overarching project, as well as being the chair for the Indigenous Steering Committee, and then the chair for the Community Reference Group will also be on the Indigenous Steering Committee as well, so that we have multiple voices and it streams through, so that we have consistency and transparency across the board. I think I answered that in 35 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, we're just coming to the end. Gav, innovative work you're doing. Do you have any reflections for the organisations and institutions attempt to engage and embed care principles in their work?
Absolutely, Grant. I think the wonderful thing about the ARDC's efforts here is really that the work package and the investment in this role is impactful, it's genuine, and it is very ambitious. And I think it really lays the groundwork for other organisations, research institutes, or in particular Anchorage Network institutes, to really consider how they may engage with and embed the care principles and engage with Indigenous data governance in a meaningful way. And so I think that's the really lovely thing about the work package is that it really sets a good, I guess, path for other organisations that engage or work in data and infrastructure to be able to embed Indigenous data governance and care principles within their work. So I think it's quite an exciting space, and I really hope that they, I encourage them to engage with us on this question further.
Yep. And Casey, what's been the highlight for you so far in your internship?
I think there's been a lot of highlights. A lot has happened in 7 months. But a straightforward answer for me is the Nichola trip. Going up there and digitising there, going to Arnhem Land for the first time was an amazing experience. Yep. And just seeing how excited everyone is when we're there for 2 weeks and digitising all this documentation. And the kids are just so excited when we're there that you can barely get them to leave the room. That's a straightforward answer. An overall one is the exposure that I've gotten through the ARDC and the IDN, and just interacting with people from all over, from data engineers, scientists, to epidemiologists and anthropologists, linguists, and the list goes on, and just trying to soak in all their knowledge and wisdom. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
You're on a journey. Unless there's going to be resources injected into the Carla location, that information is not going to be available into the next 100 years. So that's something for the younger generation to think of. And lastly, Marcia, I'll come back because it's important to respect the cultural authority. You've done an exceptional amount of work in your time, and as we're coming up here, we talk both about getting older and your tiredness and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's important to acknowledge you personally for all the work you've done, not only in this data space, but in general, across fighting for justice for Aboriginal people and it's not always appreciated, and it's not always valued and respected. And in the system that we need your voice to be listened to, and people need to formulate public policy informed by your information and your heartfelt commitment. So that's something for young ones to sit back. You want to talk about sitting on the shoulders of giants? You're sitting right here with one now. Last question, how does your Indigenous governance framework accommodate Indigenous data sovereignty principles?
Well, you know, my view is that the care principles in particular are universal principles that include, I think, everything that's intended by the Indigenous data sovereignty principles. And, you know, because data is relational and we need to share data and we need to, you know, have interoperability and findability and so on, we therefore need to have principles that are very clear and universal and that go to the ethics of using and reusing data. And so my personal view is that the Indigenous data sovereignty principles are covered by the care principles, and there's no conflict. However, what arises in practice is that you have to apply the principles to each instance of working with data in, you know, any context. And people need to be trained to do that. People need to understand what the cultural sensitivities are. And they're going to be very different in North East Arnhem Land in relation to the Literature Production Centre, where you have, you know, many languages and a lot of cultural rules about using language and levels of language, adult language versus children's language, etc., as compared with, say, well, our experience on the weekend of working with uniquely linked data sets in relation to, well, for instance, dialysis, renal replacement therapy, getting clinicians and analysts to look at that data, ask questions of it, and answer those questions, and then you start coming up with really original insights, like it's not good enough that hospitals, whether they're metropolitan, rural, private or tertiary, tick a box saying yes, they have an Aboriginal liaison officer to meet with their renal patients. That is not sufficient information. We need more information to improve the patient journey. E.g., did the Aboriginal liaison officer meet with the patient? For how long? How many times? And so you see it goes beyond cultural sensitivity to the actual needs of the patient. So in that context, it arises out of, you know, looking at that particular data set. Yep. So we need to train people to work with data in relation to the care principles. Yep. And you know, ethics is obviously an overriding factor, but so too improving data, improving the outcomes for Indigenous people, which goes to justice, equity and so on. So I hope that's an answer for a very interesting and question that we will need to consider a lot more in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, and just one final comment from me personally. We often talk about acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered, pay their respects. Our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. But in the context of Indigenous data, closing the gap, we need to ask Australian governments, state governments, local governments, how they are authentically doing what they're actually saying, particularly in this data space. So on that note, I will call it to an end. I apologise to Kristen and to Marcia because you both had 10 minutes each, so I cut you off by 2 minutes. So my apologies. But thank you very much, Casey, to Gavin, to Danielle, Neenah, to Kristen, to Marcia and to Nichola for your presentations. I hope that was useful for you. Thank you.